Well, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Fahrbach. The AI market is booming, but warnings from U.S. business leaders suggest the hype may be masking a bubble. At the same time, governments are responding to urgent harms, from addictive social media features to child safety crises. We examine whether Europe can seize this moment to set a model for trust, security, and accountability with Marietje Schaake, non-resident fellow at Stanford University and the author of the Tech Coup. Welcome to TVP World. Good to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you wrote an article, and I just want to start with this quote here. This comes from the FT. You wrote, "Europe must be ready when the AI bubble bursts." Now, also in recent weeks, we've had also words from top officials in business, from Cisco CEO, JP Morgan, warning the AI market may be a bubble, very much like the .com bubble burst. So how certain are we this will happen? And how should Europe respond to all this? How are we ready, or do we risk something very serious down the line?
Well, with the first part of your question, how certain are we? No one can ever be certain, because there's a lot of high-stake gambling with this model of AI, where we see big tech platforms and chip providers. You know, let's take as the example NVIDIA, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, big companies in sort of mutually dependent relationships, and of course financial institutions offering loans to some of these tech companies in order to then buy chips, invest in data centers. So there's a lot of risk being taken, and nobody knows where that will lead, but the ingredients to call this a bubble are there. A lot of analysts have made that diagnosis, and now even AI leaders and people in the financial services sector are warning. So that's one. In terms of where Europe stands, I think we should not be too distracted about what happens in other parts of the world, but focus much more about creating alternatives that are made in Europe. Why? One, because it's good for competitiveness in our economy, but particularly because the president in the United States, where we buy most of our technology and use most of our technology, has enormous power and can use this power to block exports, to impose sanctions, and to weaponize our dependency on US tech. And so I think it's most important that, irrespective of the bubble, we focus on doing our own homework in Europe. The name of the game has long been regulation, but it's too reactive. We really need to build, build, build.
Okay. It sounds good on paper, but you're saying that we have to make our own alternatives in Europe. I mean, there's still a massive amount of data centers, massive amount of potential that's coming out of the United States. The Chinese are also building at hyper scale. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned regulation, but what is the recipe? How do we make that feasible here in Europe? Where do we start with that?
Well, I actually think regulation is too often a distraction of having to offer alternatives that we need to develop. Now, in fact, there are a lot of data centers that are housed in Europe, but they are housing US tech products. And so we have to make sure that if we want this digital sovereignty, this strategic autonomy that a lot of people talk about, and I know people in Poland are sensitive about as well, that we need to also have data centers for European companies, and that we look at the talent we have, the startups we have, the scale-ups we have, and make sure that they have the access to capital, but that we also find a confidence in doing AI and other tech our own way. We don't have to copy the Silicon Valley model, which operates on the basis of massive scale, but also extraction of data, of resources, including impact on the environment. There are many paths to success that Europe can explore that pay more respect to fundamental rights and values, but that also do not do the bigger is better model, but that look much more at strategic ways in which we can apply AI. You talked about trust and safety. If we put that first, I'm convinced it can be a competitive advantage compared to the US, where all regulation is now let loose. While all experts on AI, whether they're in academia or in companies, warn about the deep consequences of this technology. And in light of those warnings, having no regulation is a foolish game.
Mm-hmm. I want to challenge you on that because, I mean, reminds me of something some years back. If we're looking at exactly this, of Europe having its own data sovereignty, very much at cloud computing. The idea was a project called Gaia X, which was also very much backed by the French, the Germans. That ended up being, well, frozen very much. It's exactly the same now. How is it different? And I mean, we have such a small market, I mean, that actually cloud is controlled by European companies. How do we get a bigger slice of that? Where does that go?
Well, it begins by prioritizing our own behavior in the right direction, our government procurement, our spending, because we in Europe are essentially subsidizing the success of Silicon Valley. And then we ask ourselves, gee, how come we don't have significant alternatives? Now, the Gaia X example is interesting for the lessons we can learn from it, because actually, while it was promoted as the joining of forces of European cloud providers, it quickly became a platform that also had American, Chinese companies joining. And I guess the best result now is that there are standards for interoperability, which, you know, it's important, but it's not the ambition with which Gaia X started. And what this small example shows you is that if Europeans do not work together seamlessly, if they don't use our collective scale, both economically and politically, that we risk being fragmented and that we play into the hands of other big players who know how to abuse that fragmentation and who then, use our own weaknesses against us. So, anyone from Mario Draghi, who's been warning that the price of non-Europe, of a lack of integration, a lack of a resilient single market is too high, to the impact that we see every day, it shows us that we need to work together better. And the Gaia X example is a good reminder of what happens if we don't.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, a lot of this technology, if we're looking at innovation, that's the key word here. I mean, regulation, as we've already mentioned, is not really a savvy word for developing businesses. But at the same time, let's say that many European consumers want a trust-first model. I mean, how do we make that marketable? I mean, what kind of parameters? We see this as special investment funds. I mean, trying to create this, it seems like an uphill battle, whereas the consumer still wants cheap access. It's a hyperscale model. That's how business works. So I'm just wondering how we change that model.
Well, look, we have a lot to work with here in Europe. I think indeed unlocking investments, and that's not just government investments, but just making sure that we have more venture capital, that it is easier for businesses to hire people, for example, but also to fire people if it's necessary, to pay them through giving stock options, all the things that are sort of, everyday practice in Silicon Valley are still something that needs to be organized here in Europe. And it means that some of the best European companies move to the US only to get money. And it's not that we're a poor continent. Our pension funds, our banks, we actually have resources, but the resources do not lead to being invested in EU tech companies, and that is a missed opportunity. The other thing is that I think people have come to look at AI too much as having one model, the big AI platforms that we know from the United States, but that are also very extractive, not just in terms of energy, water, land use, but also in terms of the data that it pulls in, the intellectual property that people leak, businesses leak when they use them. And in fact, there are a lot of industries, think about financial services, think about defense, think about transportation, think about publishing, where the user cannot afford to hope that the AI platform that they use will help them be compliant. And so there's a big opportunity for indeed that trust and safety-based AI that you mentioned in the form of applied AI that I think Europe should really focus on. It's a different model than the US one, but it's one that can be very, very successful. And the whole idea that regulation is at odds with innovation is, of course, a caricature. Mm-hmm. Because, in the whole sustainability field, environmental rules have led to the development of solar panels, electric vehicles, and all kinds of innovations to prevent CO2 emissions and to ensure more efficiency. So the idea that regulation gets in the way of innovation, it's a nice story, but it's not true.
Right. And it's also an interesting point, isn't it? Because we keep talking about trying to build values, trust. We hold on ourselves by European values and regulations, but as we already established, a lot of this data is then carried to the United States, these big tech companies. So let's go over that for a moment. Let's also look at that trust, that core trust idea. We've had a lot of those things, especially with AI, just recently also in Spain, looking at child safety, right? Spain, I think, recently reported 3 million AI-generated explicit images of minors in just 11 days. This is coming up to the fore. Are we able, in your mind, looking at safety for children, for minors, and trust, can that be a kind of, let's say, springboard for enticing European development in some of these platforms? Will that be the ticket? How do you see this go forward in protecting minors as well?
Well, look, protecting children is something that we should all feel responsible for. And the fact that it has come to a point that we are discussing whether it's a problem, that there are platforms like Grok, built by Elon Musk, that are created while facilitating the undressing of women and children, to me is completely bizarre. You know, we should have protected our children better, and it shouldn't take so long to respond to this. The same goes for the addictive algorithms and all the consequences that it has for the development of their mental and brain capacity, for education and concentration. And frankly, it's a problem that adults also struggle with. So the harm coming from these models that are built to keep us hooked, that are built to to create growth, even if it is at the expense of children and the well-being of our societies, is a problem. And I think we've let it go too far in Europe. We now have the added challenge of a US administration that talks about wanting to attack and undermine the European Union. And the CEOs of tech platforms, of all the popular apps that you're now looking at here on the TV screen, that are actually risking becoming instruments in the attacks on the European Union through manipulating our public debate, steering election outcomes, fueling polarization, so taking very, confrontational and controversial topics and then using that to exploit the differences in our societies. We should really not be naive about the role that tech platforms can play, not only because of the business models and the CEOs behind it, but also because they are instruments in the hands of an imperialist government in the United States. I wish it wasn't so, but we cannot be naive.
All right, let's talk about some of those CEOs. Mark Zuckerberg, and going to that case in California right now, high profile in terms of how much of this is going to be decided exactly about this addiction problem. He is set to speak at this trial. His testimony is going to be important. How do you think this is going to play out? What's the ruling going to be?
Oh, well, it's up to the judges. It's really hard for me to predict. But what I think is really important is what we can learn about the practices of meta companies that include Facebook, Instagram, and what was known about the harm to young people and what was pushed aside in the interest of making profit, right? And I think that this fundamental lack of transparency that we're all confronted with, sometimes there's a whistleblower that we learn a little bit from. Now there's a court case that we can learn a little bit from, but it's not the same as structural systematic transparency, which is vital to learning in the public interest what the impact of these tech platforms is. Are they used for making kids addicted, promoting self-harm? Are they used to manipulate and undermine our elections? What are the consequences? Why can't we have more structural transparency? In the EU, it's been written in the Digital Services Act that there should be transparency, but I believe it should be much more structural. The AI Act doesn't have it, for example. And so we are made to connect bits and pieces, and some of those bits and pieces will probably come out in this court case. I think it is important that we see this kind of accountability in the United States because, of course, the name of the game there is deregulation. But we can see here that people are looking for accountability. There are increasingly popular movements that are very critical of big tech and AI companies. And so, if there's not a responsible government that guides these companies with guardrails, then we will see much more resistance and criticism coming up from society itself. And I think this court case is interesting in that respect as well, how the responses will be, whether parents will simply ask something better to protect their children.
Right, so a lot of issues there: security, trust, accountability, business, all connected to AI. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all those insights today. Marietje Schaake, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching. It concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.